Grocery shopping in the 1970s in Australia was a completely different experience. No barcodes at the checkout, no loyalty apps tracking your spending, no self-checkout lanes. Just a metal trolley, a handwritten list, and a cashier who knew the price of every tin on the shelf. The 1970s were when Woolworths and Coles began their quiet takeover of Australian food retail, when inflation made every trip to the shops more expensive than the last, when the country was still learning to think in kilograms and cents. Let's walk through what grocery shopping actually felt like in 1970s Australia. Let's step into that world. It started at the kitchen table, usually on a Wednesday or Thursday evening. That was when the Woolworths and Coles catalogues arrived folded inside the newspaper, thick with this week only specials and end-of-aisle deals. You would spread them out flat under the kitchen light and read through the prices carefully. And you would circle what you needed. You would compare what each store was offering that week. Mince might be cheaper at Coles, canned tomatoes might be on special at Woolworths. You would work through both catalogues with a pen, deciding which store was worth the drive and which deals justified a second stop. The shopping list was written on paper. Often it was the back of an envelope or a notepad kept in the kitchen drawer for exactly this purpose. You organised it by store, and then within each store, roughly by aisle. The trip had to happen before Saturday afternoon. There was no Sunday trading. If you ran out of something midweek, you made do until the next trip. The list was a budget document as much as a reminder. You knew what you could spend, and you planned the list around that number before you wrote the first item down. Coupons appeared in the catalogues and sometimes loose in the newspaper. You clipped the ones worth keeping and folded them into your purse or wallet. A few cents off a tin of SPC peaches or a packet of Arnott's biscuits added up across a full trolley. The metric conversion made comparison shopping harder than it should have been. Australia had switched to decimal currency in 1966, so dollars and cents were familiar enough. But the shift to metric weights and measures came through 1974 and 1975, and it landed in the middle of the supermarket in the most practical way possible. Mince that had been priced per pound was now priced per kilogram. Tins that had listed ounces now listed grams. Working out which product was actually cheaper required a moment of mental arithmetic in the aisle that the older generation found genuinely irritating. You would stand there with two tins, doing the division in your head, not entirely certain you had it right. The petrol situation made the planning matter more. The 1973 oil crisis hit Australian families hard, and prices at the bowser climbed sharply through the middle of the decade. Driving across town to save a few cents on mince stopped making straightforward sense. You calculated whether the savings at a second store were worth the extra fuel. Either way, the car trip was a cost to factor in. The retail landscape was shifting fast. And the mixed business and the corner store had been the centre of food shopping for the previous generation. They were still present in the early 1970s, particularly in the inner suburbs and in country towns. You could walk to them. The owner knew your name. In the early part of the decade, many families still divided the shop. Dry goods and canned food from the supermarket, meat from the butcher, produce from the fruit shop. Woolworths and Coles were pushing steadily toward the one-stop model, and by the mid-1970s, the consolidated weekly shop was winning. The older generation felt the loss clearly. The mixed business had been a social institution as much as a shop. A child could be sent with a handwritten note and a few coins to collect cigarettes for a parent, pocketing the change for a small bag of mixed lollies weighed out at the counter. The owner knew the family by name. The supermarket offered none of that texture. It offered efficiency and reliably lower prices. And for most families in the 1970s, with inflation climbing steadily, that combination was enough. By the time you loaded the children into the Holden and reversed out of the driveway, you had already done a significant amount of work. The list was in your bag. The catalogues were on the kitchen bench. The coupons were folded and ready. Shopping was a planned activity, not a casual errand. You arrived ready, because the alternative was coming home short of something important with no easy remedy until the following week. The smell hit you first. Floor polish, the cool damp air from the produce section, cardboard from deliveries stacked near the stockroom door, and underneath it all, something faintly metallic from the refrigerated cases running along the back wall. The fluorescent lights covered the full length of the ceiling and hummed at a frequency you stopped noticing after the first minute. Easy listening music came through speakers near the roof. Something instrumental, something unhurried, something that has lodged permanently in the memory of everyone who pushed a trolley through those aisles. The trolley was metal and heavier than it looked. The wheels squeaked and pulled to one side. You compensated without thinking after the first few meters. Some stores required a 10-cent coin deposit to release a trolley from the bay near the entrance. You got the coin back when you returned it. Trolleys came back because the coin was worth retrieving. The produce section was near the entrance and shaped entirely by what was in season. In winter, that meant pumpkin, potatoes, onions, cabbage, carrots, and apples. In summer, the range opened to tomatoes, beans, and stone fruit. Flying produce in from interstate to cover seasonal gaps did not exist in any practical sense. You bought what was available. You planned meals around what was available. The selection was limited and nobody considered that unusual. Everything in the produce section was loose. You would select individual potatoes and apples and place them in a brown paper bag. You would carry the bag to the scale mounted on a post in the middle of the section. You would weigh it yourself and read the price per kilogram from the chart beside the scale. You would write the price on the bag using the Chinograph pencil hanging on a string. Avocados were not a standard item. Fresh herbs were absent from most stores. The produce section was functional, vegetables for cooking rather than experimenting. The deli counter ran along one wall or stood as a dedicated island somewhere in the store. You took a number from the dispenser and waited your turn. The counter smelled cold and faintly savoury, the slicer running steadily behind the glass. You would tell them what you wanted. You would ask for Fritz slice thin, or a 1/4 kilogram of leg ham, or a handful of Cheerio sausages. They would slice it, weigh it, wrap it in white paper, and write the price by hand on the outside. Regulars were recognised. Fritz was the South Australian name. In New South Wales and Victoria, it was Devon. In Western Australia, it was Polony. The name changed by state, but the product was in most households regardless. The dairy section ran along the back wall behind refrigerated glass doors that fogged briefly when you pulled them open. Milk came from state-based dairies, Paul's in Queensland, Dairy Farmers in New South Wales, Pura in Victoria. The bottles had moved from glass to waxed cardboard cartons and then to plastic jugs through the early part of the decade. You checked the date carefully because the milk was not ultra-pasteurised and spoiled faster than today's versions. Cheese was mostly Coon cheddar and processed slices. Ski yogurt was appearing in more flavours through the mid-1970s, but remained a minor item. Eggs came in paper cartons from a regional supplier whose name was printed along the side. The biscuit aisle was long and dominated almost entirely by Arnott's. The red packets of Scotch fingers, the iced Vovos with their pink icing and coconut, the Tim Tam, already more than a decade old by the mid-1970s and thoroughly established as a household staple, the Monte Carlo, the Kingston. You would stand in the aisle comparing prices, calculating whether the larger size represented genuine savings, and negotiating with the children about which one was coming home this week. The compromise was usually one treat packet and one plain packet of SAO crackers or Vita wheat. Everyone understood the terms without having to state them. The centre aisles held the canned goods, and canned goods were the structural foundation of the weekly shop. SPC fruit in syrup, Egel peas and corn, Heinz baked beans and Campbell's French onion soup, Bushell's tea on the shelf above, Golden Circle pineapple pieces. In the early part of the decade, some tins still carried ounces on the label, while new stock showed grams. Both sat on the same shelf. You bought what was on special, and you bought more than one. Canned goods lasted indefinitely, and buying 6 tins at 23 cents each when marked down was straightforward household logic. Your pantry held the surplus. The freezer section was a short run of chest freezers and upright cases along one wall. Bird's Eye dominated. a frozen peas in a cardboard box, fish fingers. Ice cream came in rectangular 2-litre tubs, mostly streets. The Golden Gay Time and the Paddle Pop were already familiar by the early 1970s and required no persuasion to sell. Freezer space at home was limited, usually the small compartment inside the refrigerator rather than a separate chest freezer, so you bought what you needed for the week and left the rest on the shelf. By the time your trolley was full, you had moved through the entire store in a more or less fixed path. The layout had guided you from produce, through dairy and deli, down the centre aisles and toward the front. You had not rushed. The trip had taken the better part of an hour before you reached the registers and joined the queue. The checkout was a row of registers along the front of the store, each staffed by a cashier. There were no conveyor belts in many stores until the late 1970s. You would unload your trolley directly onto the counter and wait while the cashier worked through the pile. The cashier would look at each item, find the price sticker, and type the amount into the register manually. You would watch the total climb with each entry. Fast cashiers were genuinely impressive. They had memorized the prices of hundreds of items and could move through a full trolley in minutes, grabbing each item, reading the sticker, or calling the price from memory, typing the number, and reaching for the next. The efficiency was earned, not automated. The register was mechanical, not computerized. It made a firm, satisfying clack with each keystroke, and the running total advanced visibly. When the last item was through, the cashier hit the total key and the cash drawer sprang open with a bell. The receipt rolled out listing every item and its price in a column you could read from top to bottom. You checked it. Math errors happened, sometimes in your favour, sometimes not. Either way, you checked. Barcodes did not exist in Australian supermarkets for the vast majority of the decade. The first scanning checkout in Australia was trialled in 1979, at the very end of the era. Before that, every item in every trolley in every Woolworths and Coles across the country was rung up by a human hand, reading a hand-applied sticker. The knowledge of the cashier was the only technology available, and the good ones were fast enough that the queue moved steadily. Bagging was done by the cashier or a packer working alongside them, often a teenager earning minimum wage on an after-school shift. They would pack your groceries into brown paper bags, placing heavy tins on the bottom, eggs and bread balanced on top. Paper bags were standard throughout the decade. Plastic bags began appearing in some stores toward the very end of the 1970s, but paper dominated. You carried the bags to the car yourself, one in each arm, sometimes a third, hooked over a wrist, and payment was cash or cheque. Bank card launched in Australia in 1974, but using a credit card for the weekly groceries was not standard practice for most households through the decade. Cash was what most people brought. You counted it out on the counter, the cashier counted the change back into your hand, and that was the transaction completed. If you paid by cheque, you wrote it out at the register, showed your identification, and the cashier checked your name against a handwritten list of known bad cheques kept near the register. Lay-by was available at most stores and used regularly by working families. You would select an item, pay a deposit, and have the store hold it while you paid the balance off in weekly or fortnightly instalments. You would return each time, pay what you could, and collect the item when it was fully paid off. It was used heavily before Christmas for toys and electrical goods, and at the start of the school year for uniforms and stationery. There was no interest charged, no credit assessment. For families without surplus cash at the end of the fortnight, lay-by made larger purchases possible without debt. Inflation was the defining pressure of the decade, and the weekly shop was where families felt it most directly. The grocery bill that had been around $12 in 1970 was closer to $25 by 1975, and pushing $40 by the end of the decade. Meat prices rose sharply. Mince that had been affordable became a calculation. Steak became a Sunday occasion rather than a midweek assumption. Families adjusted by buying cheaper cuts, stretching meals further, and cutting back on treats. The weekly shop that had once included small indulgences became a strictly functional exercise in some households. Store brands appeared toward the end of the decade as Woolworths and Coles introduced their own generic lines. The packaging was plain, a white or pale yellow with simple black text and no imagery. Home brand flour, home brand sugar, home brand baked beans. The quality was usually acceptable. The price was reliably lower, but buying them carried a social signal that shoppers were aware of. It meant the week had been tight. Some shoppers refused on principle, loyal to the name brands they had always bought. Others switched without hesitation and kept the difference. The choice said something about how the fortnight had gone, and most people in the queue behind you could read it. Trading stamps were a loyalty system that preceded the digital points programs of later decades. Woolworths ran its own stamp scheme, issuing stamps based on your purchase total that you licked and pasted into small cardboard booklets at home. When you had filled enough books, you exchanged them for items from a printed catalogue. Toasters, blankets, cutlery sets, toys. D. Families saved their books for months, sometimes an entire year, working toward a specific item they had circled. The booklets were kept in kitchen drawers alongside the scissors and the coupons. The social pace of the shopping trip was part of what made it take as long as it did. You ran into neighbours in the biscuit aisle and stopped to compare what was on special that week. You exchanged a few words with the woman behind the deli counter while she sliced your frites. You recognised the cashier from the previous Thursday, and she recognised you. Shopping was slower and more personal than anything that followed it. The store was a place where the community encountered itself in an ordinary, unremarkable, weekly way. It was not a destination. It was simply where life happened on a Thursday morning. What defined grocery shopping in 1970s Australia was the manual nature of everything. No automation, no scanning, and no computerized systems tracking inventory or totaling purchases. Every price was typed by a human hand. Every item was weighed or stickered or recalled from memory. Every transaction was counted out in cash or written in a check and verified against a handwritten list. The experience required more time and more human interaction at every stage than anything available today. A trip that takes 40 minutes now took closer to 90 minutes then, and that was simply what shopping required. For those who shopped for groceries in 1970s Australia, the memories are specific. The smell of the deli counter and the floor polish mixed together near the entrance. The weight of brown paper bags carried two at a time to the car. The sound of the mechanical register and the spring of the cash drawer opening. The quiet satisfaction of a full pantry going into the weekend. The steady frustration of watching the same items cost more each month without anything visibly changing except the number on the sticker. Grocery shopping in 1970s Australia represented an era caught between the old neighbourhood mixed business and the modern supermarket duopoly that would come to define everything that followed. The 1970s were the decade the old way ended. The corner store held on in some streets until the late 1970s, and then it was gone. The personal service, the owner who knew your order, the credit extended to long-standing regulars, all of it gave way to something larger and more efficient and considerably less personal. Between the mixed business era and the Woolworths and Coles dominance that followed, the 1970s were the transitional decade. For those who remember, the experience is gone, but the memories remain.